every time we hear him going to the region or coming from the region, we have a public commentary going on rather than what I've been used to over the years. A communication that is kept out of the public glare. I think that's the way you hope to make progress.
The question of whether or not to recognise a Palestinian state continues to dominate global politics. Canada has joined the UK and other Western nations in saying now is the time with certain conditions, leading Donald Trump to respond, "Wow, that will make it very hard for us to make a trade deal with them. Oh, Canada." Well, as the president's envoy arrives in Israel, the US looks increasingly isolated. But for the countries that do support recognition, the questions are mounting. What would a Palestinian state look like in reality? Here's the Business Minister, Gareth Thomas, trying to answer that question, speaking to Rosie Wright and Callum MacDonald on Times Radio Breakfast.
That state of Palestine would be based on the 1967 borders. Of course, there would have to be land swaps and there would be a shared capital of Jerusalem. They are well-regarded international views. 140 other countries have already recognised the state of Palestine. The Prime Minister was in talks this week with a series of countries, including Canada, and Canada have overnight, as you'll have seen, taken the decision to recognise Palestine in September.
That's the Government Minister Gareth Thomas talking about land swaps and shared capital and returning to the 1967 borders. Well, those conditions, one has to say, are so far from the current reality that some of Britain's most prominent lawyers and peers have written to Keir Starmer warning that recognition of Palestine may actually break international law. Baroness Deitch, Ruth Deitch, led the drafting of the letter. Good afternoon, Ruth.
Hello.
Ruth, can you just summarise for us why you think this breaks, the proposal made by the Prime Minister might break international law?
Well, the Montevideo Convention of 1933 codified what was international law at the time. It hasn't been disputed since. And it's been so binding that it's now regarded as part of customary law, even if you didn't sign the convention. And it makes a lot of sense. You have to have a settled population, defined boundaries, an effective government, and an ability to enter into relationships with other states. And Palestine doesn't have any of those. I think the statement by the minister on Times Radio this morning just shows what a pickle the government has got into over this, because to talk of land swaps, I mean, who's going to organise those? Divided Jerusalem. Divided capital cities don't work, you know. We've seen that with Berlin, with Nicosia and others. The 1967 borders, does he mean before the 67 war or after? But most importantly, as you pointed out, over 100 states have recognised Palestine, and it hasn't made any difference on the ground. It hasn't promoted peace or well-being or abiding by the law or ample food for everybody, a stable government, nothing like that. Things have to change a great deal. I'm not saying the Palestinians don't have the right to self-determination. They certainly do, but self-determination has to express itself in a viable way.
Listening to some of those who take the other side in this particular debate, they make the argument that these conditions that you set out, the Montevideo conditions, did not apply to Israel when it was recognised by most states in 1948, and that in reality this is political rather than legal.
Well, if it's political, it's not going very well, is it? And Israel, of course, the problem with Israel then was that as soon as it had its boundaries, the Arab states invaded it there and then in 1948. But it did fulfill those conditions. Now, today is a very different situation. And the irony is that the Palestinians were offered a state at least 4 times in the last 90 years. They've turned it down every time. I found statements by Mahmoud Abbas saying they don't want to give the Palestinians citizenship or a state. What they want is the so-called right of return to what they regard as their homes in what is now Israel. In other words, they want to overrun Israel and have one state achieved by force. So we're not yet in a position to talk about two states.
Well, of course,
Three.
sorry, Ruth, finish what you were
I'm
saying.
going to say that arguably you could say there are three. There's Gaza, there's West Bank, there's Jordan. Jordan has, I believe, 6 million Palestinian residents. If you trace back the mandate in history, there's a case for saying that there was yet another effort to create an Arab state, and that didn't work either.
Well, of course, Palestinians would make the case that Israel itself has a constitutional law that is the equivalent of the right of return. That is to say, pretty much anybody who is Jewish has a right to enter Israel. Why would one apply a different principle to Palestinians?
Because Palestinians have got territory, the West Bank, and there's no reason why that shouldn't be shared, and Gaza. So it's quite different. The Jews who went to Israel and exercised their right of return had been pushed out of all the Middle Eastern countries in the 1940s because of the creation of Israel and anti-Semitism. They'd been pushed out of the whole of Europe. They had nowhere else to go at all. And if you have to have a definition of citizenship, that's as good as any. If the Palestinians set up a state, then all the Palestinians who live in the Palestinian diaspora, Egypt, Lebanon, and so on, they should have a right of return to that Palestinian state.
What do you make of this idea of land swaps? Do you have any idea which bit of land would be swapped for which other bit of land?
No, I don't. I know there have been proposals like that in the past, but they don't seem to have come to fruition. I do sometimes think that given that 2 million Arabs live in Israel peacefully, there's no reason why some Jews shouldn't live in the West Bank. If that becomes Palestine, why shouldn't they live peacefully together? We don't want yet another Middle Eastern Judenrein state, do we? There ought to be some element of being able to live and let live together on the West Bank.
It strikes me, of course, that there's a series of different positions which are put forward here. Many of them sound pretty reasonable. And for example, the point you've just made, it doesn't sound mad to me. But the truth of the matter is nobody's listening to anybody else. How do we get ourselves out of the situation that we're in now? And I think particularly, of course, people in this country, in the United States, elsewhere, who are watching the scenes from Gaza are frankly now impatient with all parties. How do we at least stop the catastrophe which is unfolding right now?
I think the surrounding Arab countries in the Middle East, they're mostly very well off, should be pulling their weight. They should be succoring the Palestinians. They should be achieving growth and peace and food, indeed, in Gaza. It shouldn't all rest with Western countries and possibly Israel. After all, there are so many very successful and prosperous Middle Eastern states. They ought to be able to look after the few million Palestinians in their midst. I mean, why are the Palestinians, for example, in Lebanon, not allowed higher education, not allowed certain jobs, kept as refugees living in camps? Why haven't they been resettled? Indeed, the same goes for Egypt and so on. There seems to be a really rather incomprehensible lack of support from the surrounding countries.
Well, I guess the Qataris and the Egyptians, and I suppose to some extent the Saudis, would say this is not their responsibility, that the situation is frozen because Israel now will not contemplate the two-state solution. And actually, it sounds, to be honest, at the moment, as though nobody wants to move, and that in the end, the only people the people who are suffering, of course, everybody suffers to some extent from insecurity in Israel and Jordan and so on, but the people who essentially have had their homes destroyed are the million plus in Gaza.
There could have been a two-state solution, as I said many times over the last few decades. It's true that feelings are very bad now, but it might start at least with Palestinian children being educated in peace rather than hating Jews and hating Israel. Let's imagine that the Palestinian Authority and Hamas recognize Israel and put down their arms. Gaza was doing fine when Israel occupied it, but pulled out in 2005. They had a chance then to build a flourishing state, instead of which they built tunnels.
Okay.
And I do wonder whether they want a two-state solution. I think they want something else. They want one state.
Okay. Ruth, thank you. Ruth Deach, the Baroness Deach, crossbench peer. Let's stay on this question for the moment. Steve Witkoff, the United States Special Envoy to the Middle East, is in Israel for talks about the humanitarian crisis. He may also, we understand, visit aid sites in Gaza run by the controversial Israeli and United States-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Oliver McTernan, the director of conflict resolution charity Forward Thinking, is in regular contact with both Hamas and with Israeli officials, and he is joining us now. Good afternoon, Oliver.
Good afternoon, Trevor.
What would you expect Witkoff to be doing, and do you anticipate that there will be any movement that he might announce?
Well, I don't expect any movement, because we've seen since Donald Trump took office, we had that agreement in January. It was broken in March. And since then, we haven't really seen any effort to find a permanent solution to the devastating conditions that the people of Gaza are suffering, and also to the hostages and their families, that both sides there are suffering. But the Gazan situation is truly beyond belief. And I would have hoped that, given his reputation, he would have been able by now to have found a way through.
What would such a way look like?
Well, first of all, I think he's got... I can't understand how they hope to achieve anything when every move is spoken publicly about. Normally in these sort of negotiations, they take place in private, if not in secret, and there is very, very little comment. But every time we hear him going to the region or coming from the region, we have a public commentary going on, rather than what I've been used to over the years. A communication that is kept out of the public glare. I think that's the way you hope to make progress.
Well, I suppose that what the White House would say is that's exactly the problem, that the conventional methods have given us some tranquility from time to time, but they have done very little to solve the underlying problems, and that people in Gaza and to some extent in the West Bank have continued to experience insecurity and poverty, and that actually it now needs some new way of approaching things. Is there any possibility, do you think, that the United States might change its position?
The possibility, I would just hope it will change, because you will recall a lot of criticism of the way Biden handled this, but he did allow the Qataris and the Egyptians to get on with the task of negotiating. And you will remember at the exchange, the first big exchange of hostages and Palestinian prisoners, the Qatari Prime Minister made the remark that it was negotiations, not bombardment, that led to the release of the hostages. Now, I think we have to keep that in mind. I would hope that America would go back to real negotiations, not just making, as I say, the public statements and then expecting one side to fall in line with what they are stating.
You make the point in many of your writings, actually, about negotiation, that central is the bond of trust. That is to say, that you're negotiating with somebody, And you first have to believe that that somebody is capable of delivering the deal. Now, we have some idea of how that works on the Israeli side. Do you think that the negotiators on the part of Hamas, who are mainly in Qatar, are actually capable of delivering any deal?
Well, I think if the deal is acceptable, they will deliver it, and they have up till now. I'm no spokesperson for either side, but just observing what has gone on, we have seen that when a deal was reached during the Biden time, each time it was delivered on. In March, it was Netanyahu who chose to break the deal, not Hamas. And I think we should keep that in mind. I think also, Trevor, what we have to keep in mind, that there were political considerations.
Okay. Sorry, forgive me, Oliver. One last quick question. Hamas is saying, apparently, that if a Palestinian state is recognised, they will disarm and disband. That, of course, is the case for what we and the Canadians and the French and the others are doing. Do you believe them when they say that?
Trevor, if we look at the history of the past 20 years, 2005, Hamas entered the political arena, first of all in Gaza, it was a test, and also in the West Bank, and they won local elections. Now, in that time, they were prepared to negotiate and to cooperate with the Israeli authorities in light of their responsibility in their role as local government. Then they entered in 2006 to a national election, which they won. We had a great opportunity, I think, in 2006, if we had accepted the outcome of that election, if we had respected the Palestinian constitution, if we had respected the legislative council set up, I think we would not be facing the terrible situation that we're confronted with today. I think it would have taken an entirely different track. Every effort that was made to get this on a political track has been sabotaged, and that partly by the international community, laying down laws from outside.
Oliver, thank you so much for your time. That was Oliver McTernan, the Director of Conflict Resolution at the charity Forward Thinking.